Well, Matt, we're starting a little bit late, but Andy will speak for, I don't know, 45, 50 or whatever minutes, however long it takes. And then we'll have a discussion, open it up for discussion afterwards. So over to you, Andy.
Thank you once again, and also to Oliver, who is in the background tonight, but is always doing all the work to make this happen. Both of you, thanks a lot. So here we are. Here's the next lecture. It's about chapter 20 again.
Can you run it?
Oh,
that's it. Yep. Okay.
And it's about the second half of chapter 20. It's about 13 sections to this chapter, a long chapter. So I've called it Advanced Topics on the simple reproduction and circulation of the total social capital, one of my snappier titles in the series. I will actually spend a bit of time covering, going over once again chapters 19 and the first part of chapter 20 before coming on to the new material, which is, I would say, is quite advanced and technical, to be honest. And it is perfectly valid, I think, for the student of this work to ask, what's the point of it, really? And I will try to sort of bring that out, but I do think also we can discuss that in the discussion section about why Marx is doing this. And it is to bear in mind. I think one of the big issues, to be honest, is the literature after Marx on this section, but also, as ever, I see it as a building block to volume 3. So it's a sort of step on in the way, but it is, and as Marx does, he goes into an awful lot of detail. And one does wonder how much of this detail we need to just get the gist of it. So I think that's quite a valid discussion to have. Marx goes into the detail, in fact, to disprove the opening thesis, if you like, which is a tactic he uses more than once, which is he posits something and then proves it can't happen. But in the proof of that it can't happen, it moves the discussion on to the next point that he wants to bring out. And there's quite a lot of that in the more advanced stuff towards the end of the chapter. Looking back on chapter 19, and especially the work in the reading group, when we read it, I mean, new things did come to light, which I just want to bring out. I mean, so this is what we opened with. We know that Adam Smith is critiqued by Marx, and he comes back to Marx a lot in this material. He comes back to Smith a lot in this material. So we know that Adam Smith breaks down the annual product into just 3 components: wages, profits, and rents. And although it comes up sometimes in reality in Smith's work, conceptually, he misses the point of constant capital, which is also part of the value of the annual product. So what Marx brings out from his critique of Smith is 2 distinctions. One is the total annual product, everything, the total value of what's produced in a year. And then separately, or sort of within that, it's the new value which has been added into the annual product during the course of a given year. Okay. And that's, I think, what Marx is pointing out is Smith's confusion. So the total annual product would include the constant capital, which has been transferred during the course of the production of a year. What Smith did recognize, and Marx carries forward an awful lot in what we're looking at in this part of volume 2, is the distinction between production, which is producing the means of production, and production, which is producing articles of consumption. I did look at how David Harvey reflects on this chapter. He likes Marx's use of Quenet a lot. And he goes into the sort of background of it, and he draws out the fact that Quenet, who was an advisor to the King of France, I think, leans heavily on William Harvey, who was a sort of a health medical scientist in the UK, who apparently was the first to point out blood circulation. Now, this is just a footnote in a sense, but it's a question of reproduction of an organic body. The idea that society is reproducing itself at a social economic level comes from the analogy of a body reproducing itself. And the way it reproduces itself is blood moves out from the heart, but moves back again. It returns to the point of starting. So the analogy with blood would be money, I think, in the case of social economic market society. The thing about this is it's only an analogy. And if you remember the analogy of metamorphosis of the caterpillar and the pupa and the butterfly, I mean, it shows metamorphosis, but the limit of these naturalistic analogies is they don't get the sort of the essential aspect of capitalist metamorphosis, which is the drive to accumulate, the drive to expand through the metamorphosis. And as it happens, I actually think that is Harvey's problem. He sees the reproduction of capital in a sort of a biological way, which doesn't quite capture the specificity of capitalist reproduction, which is also actually about capitalist accumulation and the drive to make profits and to accumulate. So he tends to interpret the reproduction of the capitalist system as this sort of, he uses it a lot, 2 or 3 times in his work, of a hydrological cycle like rivers and seas and clouds and all that. But I mean, it's only an analogy, right? And the point is, what it misses, it captures the idea of process, but what it misses is the inherent drive to accumulate, which is the sort of the differentia specifica of the capitalist system. So that's an aside, but it's an important one, I think. Right. Um, Also, in reading this chapter 19, I was very struck by a theme which Marx has planted very early on in chapter 1 of volume 1, the difference between abstract labor and concrete labor. And I'm sure everybody remembers that his concept there is that abstract labor produces the aspect of the commodity, which is called exchange value, the monetary aspect, if you like, when it's on the market. And then there's another aspect of the same labor at the same time, which is producing the use value. And the use value is the particularity of the thing that's being produced. So, a tailor has performs a different concrete labor to a weaver. But of course, they're both part of the social organism which is producing commodities. So you've got this duality of their labor between the concrete, the particular, if you like, and the abstract, which is the social and the general. Now, what's striking is, and it's very overlooked, I have to tell you, right? But you'll find in chapter 8 of volume 1, Marx actually repositions what the distinction between abstract and concrete labor is. And this is one of the things I sort of harp on about, is how what Marx calls the commodity, its determination of the commodity, he develops as he goes through Capital. And as he develops determination of commodity, so a lot of the related concepts develop as well. And the concept of abstract and concrete labor actually develops once we've got a capitalist commodity. And you'll find in volume 1, Marx says, well, abstract labor is value creating labor. It's, you think of the division of the working day, it's very close, in my view, to the socially necessary labor time, right? It's a sort of a homogenized, normalized, socially necessary labor time. Now, concrete labor, he says, is that which converts the constant capital, brings the constant capital into the commodity product. So it's a different emphasis between abstract and concrete labor. And this, Marx comes back to this 2 or 3 times in the material we're looking at here, because of course, this relates when you project it onto the totality of a commodity producing system, a total social capital, then the concrete labor is to do with bringing over the constant capital. Remember, I was saying before about the difference between the new value created in the year and the total value passed into the commodity product in a year. Well, that's also a reflection of a difference between concrete and abstract labor. So it puts it into a new light again, which I think is a real unnoticed part of his argument, actually. There's another very interesting thing in chapter 19, which is in his critique of Smith. He says, well, this is what Smith should have done, right? Because what Smith is doing is he's looking at commodities that are already capitalist, they're already commodity capital. But what he needed to do in order to get here is to have a prior analysis. And what Marx then spells out is 2 other phases of prior analysis, which actually reveal the conscious design of his own work, right? So what he says, right, we're looking at commodities produced in the capitalist manner, right? But before that, the prior analysis, we should have looked at valorization and value formation. And that in turn, there's a presupposition, right, of commodity before commodity circulation. In other words, we have to look at commodity production. That's the valorization, right, within a capitalist system. And then even before that, we need a prior analysis of the commodity, which is independent and becomes then capitalist commodity. So it's actually a good signpost to the conscious design of his own steps in his own method, which he certainly considered as being a scientific approach. Okay, when we come on to chapter 20, once again, I emphasize just here its reproduction and circulation. This is a point which is not in this chapter title, but it's in the section part title, and it's quite important to keep it in mind, right? So it's about the circulation of the total social capital in commodity form. That's a sort of the focus of the analysis, right? And what we've got then is the movement of commodity capital and its exchange for money. So that's a sort of the angle, the perspective at which Marx is looking at. And this is the reminder. He asks two questions. They're both how questions, right? How is the capital consumed in production replaced in its value out of the annual product? I mean, that's very much a reproduction question. How do we come back to what we had this year, next year? How's it being replaced? And then how is the movement of this replacement intertwined with the consumption of surplus value by the capitalist and of wages by the workers? So he's bringing in a class relation, but he's bringing it in through the lens or through the sort of the perspective of buyers and sellers, capitalists buying and selling and workers buying commodities. Now, as again, this is just a reminder, reproduction on a simple scale means that the constant capital stays the same from one year to the next. There are assumptions here. There's no sort of changes in productivity and commodities sold at their values. But what this means, and this is the focal point of what he's using as the sort of the way into all this, right, is that all the new value that's been produced during a year, which is now in commodity form, is consumed by the capitalist and the working class. Of course, that's a direct corollary of the first point, which is all the constant capital is the same from one year to the next. So what we've got then is a society's total product, which is divided between these two departments: means of production, means of consumption, right? Department 1, Department 2. And again, this is a sort of a reprise, but now we can begin to see how a lot of his early work is built as a sort of bigger and bigger theme. And Marx is bringing use value back in here. I mean, it's at a very high level of abstraction, but it's there. It's, what are this stuff going to be used for? And what it's used for is a condition of how we see the economic structure of how it's produced as well. Okay, so there's a connection between how it's produced and how it's used. And the use value, therefore, matters in terms of how the society overall is being reproduced, economically at least. Okay, so again, this is a bit of a reminder, but I think it might be worthwhile. I hope it is. So we've got this diagram here, which is of the two departments. I'll cut out the thousands. So we've got in production, the inputs to production are 4,000 constant capital, 1,000 variable capital paying for the workers' labor power. And the product that's produced in a year in Department 1 is C plus V plus S, which is 6,000. Okay, so the new value will be all of V plus S. The new value is more than just the surplus value. It's the equivalent of the wages. It's the reproduction of the variable capital, which is done in the necessary labor time, and then the surplus value, which is added in the surplus labor time. Okay, so that's Department 1. And then we have a similar sort of breakdown, but the numbers happen to be half for a reason which we'll come on to. So this is the production of means of consumption. So the first one is machines, mostly. Some raw materials could go in there as well. And the second one is mopeds and peas, okay, means of consumption, and yachts, which we'll come on to. And these are the figures which Marx uses. So how the total annual product is consumed differs by department. Okay, so department one product goes back as means of production the next year. They're consumed in production, and department two commodities are consumed outside of direct capitalist production. Okay, and it's an assumption that they're consumed the next year as well. Okay, and as we've already said, and I'll probably repeat it, repetition for emphasis, is simple reproduction is production on the same scale from one year to the next. Okay, so the new value is in department one is this 1000V and 1000S, and the new value in department two is 500V and 500S. So total new value across the two departments is £3,000. Okay, obviously it's going to be 3,000 million billion or something, but we'll just say thousands following Marx. Now the point is, those two amounts must equal all the commodities for consumption outside of production that are produced in the year. Okay, that's also 3,000. And that is the sort of the basic condition of simple reproduction. So Marx has set up his figures for that to work. He's not arbitrary figures. He's designed those figures for it to work. And then he just breaks it down. So the means of production produced, the machines that are produced in department one will be used to produce more machines next year. Okay, I don't know, the trucks, mostly machinery, lathes and factory stuff mostly. Okay, but some of the machines that are produced this year, the commodities product will go into the machines which are used to produce means of consumption next year. The machines that make the peas and the mopeds. Okay, go there. So what we have then is an equality between these two amounts, right? Which is the machine produced for means of production in department two going to equal the production here of department two of the commodity product, which goes back to department one. I'll explain that a bit more as we go along, but that's his next rule. And of course, the production of department two either goes back to the workers as variable capital, or it goes to the capitalists as surplus value. Okay, so that's the basic picture. There's loads of assumptions here which we've talked about before. There is one assumption which is very specific, which I overlooked basically in the last lecture, which I want to bring out. Right, is a distinction between constant capital consumed, and what that comprises is two types of capital. Right, the one is the circulating capital that's been applied. And the circulating capital is normally raw materials, circulating content capital, raw materials and ancillary materials, plus the depreciation of fixed capital over the year. Okay, so fixed capital does come in to these departments, but only directly insofar as it's depreciated year on year. So when we're saying that, the product of department one is 4,000 plus 1,000 plus 1,000. The 4,000 constant capital consumed, an element of that will be the depreciation of the fixed capital in department one. Okay. Another part of the fixed capital, which is the machines in the buildings, this part, which is not depreciating during the given year, this isn't actually part of what Marx's numbers, if you like, the equations which he's giving us. Okay. But fixed capital is not excluded. It's just that it enters into this in a particular way, insofar as it gives up its value year on year as it's been used to produce capitalist commodities. That's how it comes in. The other thing is that Marx's presentational order is quite challenging. There's key passages on these pages, 473, 474, Marx tends to lead by worked example. And so it's useful to have some idea of two things, really. One is, let's have more examples. He does give some examples, but let's have some more examples of the type of commodities we're talking about. And there are some examples there on the slide. And he does provide the rules about what needs to be satisfied for simple reproduction. But when he first introduces it, it almost appears a bit like sort of yin and yang. It almost appears as sort of two naturally harmonious and neatly fitting symbiotic sort of departments. Actually, the more it goes on, the more it becomes clear Marx is not arguing that. There is a proportionality rule, but there's no necessary equilibrium. And the more he goes into it, this sort of organic type of analogy, it just falls away more and more, because the way that the way the departments actually interact with each other is through a whole series of monetary transactions, and they don't work as aggregate departments. They work as individual capitalists and groups of workers buying and selling and so on. And so there's a myriad of these sort of transactions, right? And there isn't actually any guarantee of equilibrium. What Marx has done is he's identified a logical necessary rule, but that's not the same as the assumption that the rule will be met. And if you like, sort of be self-correcting society will keep going back to that rule. Okay, so the general rule. So if you, I mean, this is the algebraic presentation, which is it's right to ask for this because it gives it in a more general way than Marx's worked example. He does present this, but I just want to sort of spell it out, if you like, right? So you can say that the new value created during the year in Department 1 is V plus S of the commodity product in Department 1. Similarly for the commodity product in Department 2. And the rule is that that has to equal the value of all of the means of consumption produced in Department 2. Okay, so we just break this out into its elements, which is what that next line is. And then you can just cancel on both sides the things that are common to both sides. And you're left with this, it reduces down to this, it resolves into this, right? The variable capital product and the surplus value product of Department 1 must be equal to the means of consumption used up in Department 2. Okay. But it works both ways. I mean, there's going to be a whole series of exchanges to make this rule work. Okay. And those are the two sides of that equality. Right. So this is just another way of showing it's a diagrammatic way. So we started off before with all the means of consumption being reproduced within Department 2, and all the means of production being reproduced within Department 1. And the one that Marx really sort of hones in on is what about the exchange between the departments? So the capitalists in Department 2 pay money to the capitalists in Department 1. That's the gold line, the money line. And the blue line is the useful means of production, which then, in exchange for money, get sold over and get used in Department 2, right? And we've got capitalists paying their workers. The workers in Department 1 use the money to buy their peas and their mopeds from Department 2. They reproduce their own labor power, and they reproduce, therefore, the variable capital in volume in Department 1. And finally, the capitalists in Department 1 buy luxury goods. They pay capitalists in Department 2 money, they buy luxury goods, and that reproduces their luxury consumption. Okay, so those are the three categories of transaction that satisfy this equality between the two departments. And as I said, it's a whole series of individual exchanges. And then Marx finally, and I'm still on just on the review, Marx goes through this as a whole series of individual transactions. If you are watching this not live, you can pause here. Now that's already quite a lot of material, but not a new material. It's about how Marx then develops this in more detail again. Okay, so this is idiomatic, but I think what the details throw up is a series of problems, and something which at first sight might seem simple. Simple reproduction seems, okay, it's slightly harder to get your head around it, but intuitively it seems to work, right? Um, Marx is basically saying, well, there's a lot of problems when you actually get into the details, and that's what we'll look at now. The variable capital is reproduced yearly. Okay, so the workers get paid every year. They use the money, their wages, to buy means of consumption. Okay, equal to the total value produced by labor in society in the course of the year. And the reason why this must be the case is that the entire value is consumed. That's the general rule that Marx has already stated. And one way of looking at this is to look at the social division of labor. So you can think of this in terms of the distinction between necessary labor, which is producing part of the new value in the year, and the surplus labor, which is producing the surplus value produced in the year. So this is the entirety of the new value. And then, of course, some of this goes back to the workers by its nature. We're saying this is necessary labor, so it's the equivalent of the wages, which will get then paid to them once again. But then you've got the surplus labor, which in a way doesn't cycle back to anywhere at all. The capitalists buy special types of commodities which nobody else can afford, and they consume them. And so there's no direct feedback. This is the siphoning off of basically the surplus product year on year. Okay. Now, for capitalists in Department 2, the value of their product does break down into C plus V plus S, as we've already said. But if you thought of it from the social point of view, Mark points out, you could just think of this as replacing the variable capital and the surplus value of all the workers and all the capitalists in the society as a whole. And he says, well, then we can understand kind of how Smith made his error, right? Because in that sort of specific limited sense, you can forget constant capital, right? Mm-hmm. And he brings in this concrete labor idea once again, as I've mentioned before. I do think actually this is a clincher in the discussion with Heinrich about what is abstract labor. He doesn't actually use the term abstract labor here, but he might as well have done, because that's the obverse of the concrete labor. So the product of this year's labor, not only insofar as this labor is considered simply as useful concrete labor, but it's also viewed as the expenditure of labor power as value forming labor. Well, that's social abstract labor. Value forming labor, that's what it is. Okay, this one, it's a bit bitty, I'm afraid. This is the constant capital in both departments. He uses this idea of the working day once again as a sort of a way of conceiving of this. And once again, it's sort of broken down. And this time he's breaking it down across the necessary and surplus labor again, but also he's talking about this in terms of the value production and the material production from this social labor in aggregate. Okay. And so you've got a totality of social capital, but you've also got a totality of social labor in play here. Right. I mean, really, the big question, he says basically it's not so hard when you worked out the value components. The real issue here is how does it work really with the use values, right? And in a way, it's completely amazing that it would work at all, because there's apparently no sort of coordination going on about who produces what for what purpose. It's all done through market mechanisms. And so he's saying you cannot think of, I mean, this type of problem would be real in any type of society, right? But you have to look at it in the way capitalist society solved this problem, right? And so you shouldn't abstract from the circulation and the way that capitalists use markets to sell their goods and to buy their goods, right? You can't abstract from the capitalist form, which is through circulation. And it's an interesting point here, because he says the totality of capital, what is it? He uses the example of a joint stock company, which is very much on his mind at the time of the 1860s, right? Because they're coming back into vogue big time in Britain, right? And he says, well, in a joint stock company, everyone knows what they're putting in, but they don't know. This one about investors, basically. They don't know what they're going to get out, right? And because they haven't yet got the profits out, right? So he's saying that this is an unknown to some degree how this comes about. There is a totality, there's a collectivity of capital. At the same time, there's an unknown about it. That's an anticipation of volume 3. He does keep going back to Adam Smith and associated writers. And once again, we've got this idea of the total value of the social product, which includes the constant capital transferred during the course of the year, plus these two elements of new value, the variable capital reproduced and the surplus value added, right? Okay. Now, the point of this one is the notion of revenue, because he sort of critiques Smith for not all flows are revenues, basically, which is, if you think of Smith's idea that the value of products can reduce down to wages plus profits, then they're sort of revenue flows. And no, he says no, it's not. They're not just revenue flows. There's another type of flow here, right? And this relates to this 6,000 C. The constant capital flows aren't really revenue. They're capitalists paying other capitalists, normally speaking, right? They're not there for consumption. So the product doesn't resolve itself just into revenue flows. Okay, it does for the consumers, but it doesn't for the entire product. Okay, and he uses an example to critique Smith, which you might find interesting to read through, of linen shirts. And actually, he traces from one producer to another. And in the end, I think there's about 6 producers in this commodity chain. And he's saying, well, they're all using a fresh load of labor, obviously, as the product moves through. But also, at each stage, there's constant capital being used also to produce this product. And so he sort of, he deconstructs basically Smith's argument, because Smith says, well, look, if you just look at this example, it's just new labor being added to new labor. But of course, it's not just new labor in the sense that there's indirect labor being added at each time, because machines are being used and other materials are being used in each stage of the production. So, it's a sort of you didn't call it a commodity chain, but that's actually what it is. Now, this is another critique of Smith. Because basically he's saying that he's building up the idea about what wages are and how they work in this system, right? So once again, we've got the value product the current year is this 2,000 in Department 1 plus 1,000 in Department 3, right? And all the other parts of the value are just value transferred. So this is the new value, is this 3,000. So what happens to this 3,000, the new value? Okay, so what are the relationships which these flows are, if you like, implementing, right? So we know that one of these flows, the 2,000 from Department 1, restores to Department 2 its constant capital in the natural form of means of production. We've already established this, right? But the angle he's coming at now is he makes this statement: what is capital for one person is revenue for another, and vice versa. But it's only partially correct. You can't take this as a generalization, because some flows are like that, but not all flows are like that. So it's not a general sort of by definition truth. Okay. And he looks at how this works with variable capital. So he looks at how workers get money, and for the workers, their wage is revenue, and they use it to spend stuff in order to reproduce their labor power. But from what the worker sells is their labor power, but under the command of the capitalist, that's still variable capital. Okay, so that is revenue, and revenue one way and capital the other way. And I'll just show this with this diagram. So we're familiar with this. I just want to highlight this. So the capitalists in Department 1 pay their workers. They pay them a wage, and with that wage, that's their revenue, right? The workers buy, say, peas or mopeds from the capitalists in Department 2. And with the Ps and mopeds, and with the unpaid domestic labor, which doesn't feature in Marx's account here, they reproduce their labor power. Okay, so that's the variable capital going back into Department 1. Now, that for the workers is an exchange of labor power for money, commodities, right? Commodities, the commodity they sell is labor power. And it's the same in Department 2. Right. Now, for the capitalists in Department 1, you start with money, they get a commodity variable capital in production now, working as active labor, which is then the product of that is then passed over to the commodity product, and it comes back as more money. So you've got this cycle, which through the forms which Marx started out the whole volume 2 with, right? So this is the stars I'm just using is to show the capitalist side of the relation rather than the worker side of the set of exchanges and relationships. And it goes on again. And of course, there's also revenue for the capitalists. So capitalists, now you see a flow here. Capitalists are spending money. They buy yachts from the capitalists who produce yachts. And some capitalists also who produce peas spend their surplus value to buy yachts as well. Right. You have to follow the money as well as following the commodity. Okay, I think this is quite pretty obvious and I won't labor it too much. Okay. I mean, the point is that the worker is never a capitalist. They never produce capital, but actually the capitalist, in a sense, possesses the worker. They always have them as their capital. Another section. We've got 3 sections to go, right? This one is a key one, actually. And I mean, probably your concentration may be wavering, but time to just think on this one. I think this one is quite important for Marx's argument. When remember we said, well, fixed capital, he doesn't actually deal with the amount of money fixed capital, but you remember there's depreciation, right? And depreciation means that each time the commodity product is sold, part of the money coming back to the capitalist, an element of it is not, it seems to be excess in their costs, their immediate costs, right? But it's not actually profit, it's replacing the value that's been transferred in a step-by-step, bit-by-bit way from their machinery and their buildings, right? So they need to keep this in reserve if they're going to continue producing not just 1 year to the next, but sort of like over 10 or even longer periods, then they're going to need to keep this as a money reserve. Marx uses the term hoard quite a lot here, okay? But at some point, they're going to have to replace those machines and those buildings. Okay, so they need to build up the reserve and then they need to spend it. So this is a necessary role, and Marx has told us this in very fully in his discussion of turnover in part 2, right? So what we've got is the replacement of depreciation capital in the money form, and he goes into this and he thinks of some examples again, as Marx is prone to do, right? His main point is that there's no knowing in advance how regular the replacement of the fixed capital needs to be. It's very open to happenstance and to variations that in 1 year you might need to replace a lot of more fixed capital than in another year. Okay, so the demand on money, it will change. They're pulling from reserve or not using up the entire reserve. Okay. So this is what he's got here. So this is, I just anticipated this slide. And he says there can be a crisis, can generate a crisis because there's a lack of money to actually pay for the replacement fixed capital. Then you can't have a sort of a even reproduction cycle going on. And he says, well, one way that capitalists can deal with this is to use foreign trade. They can use this in either direction to help with the replacement of fixed capital. And he also says, well, we compare what's relatively anarchic. He says this is an anarchic element in capitalist society. He says even basically in a socialist society, you would have this issue, you'd have this problem. And the way to solve it in a socialist society would be to have a relative overproduction. You'd probably need to produce more things than you might need because you might need more than you've actually got. If you know what I mean, if you need to produce, you need to have a contingency of machines being produced because they might wear out more quickly or for some other reason, right? So there's a slight sort of societal overhead involved, and he talks about an overproduction, which he says is entirely rational. I mean, you can see why that would happen in a rational society, but in a capitalist society, that's completely anarchic. I mean, there's no center of rationality in that sense controlling it, right? So he sees this as one potential explanation of crisis, and he says, this disproportion of fixed and circulating capital and the need to maintain a proportionality is a way of seeing how prices can emerge. And it's also pretty clear that there's anarchy, there's no controlling element. So why not? The prompt is, well, why not have a controlling element even within capitalist society? Why don't we have a state which begins to regulate, how much of this, that, and the other are being produced? And so it's quite possible to insert a fairly social democratic sort of point here, right? Which is to have state policies to overcome the anarchic elements within the capitalist system. And of course, David Harvey discusses this, I think, in a fairly, he's sort of, the idea occurs to him. He doesn't opt strongly for a social democratic solution, by the way, in this discussion, but he does sort of see, how it could come in here. The other big issue that Marx raises here, which we will come back to with Rosa Luxemburg, so I won't go into a lot of detail on it, right? But Marx recognizes that he's made this limiting assumption of metallic money. And so he's always got this issue in the background about gold and silver production. And he basically positions gold and silver production within Department 1, insofar as they are not luxury items, because of course you could put them in Department 2 if you're thinking of a production of luxury items. So it's, we'll see that Luxembourg has quite a go about that, actually, right? And the other big issue that he assumes is that there's enough gold produced in any given country to service its needs for gold. And metallic money would have needs just in terms of keeping the coins, up, wear and tear of the coins, maintenance, right? And he goes back to chapter 17 and summarizes the main points. That I will return to this, so I don't want to labor this. Probably your concentration is beginning to go, but I just want to come back to this one of that section, right? This is another point he's making, right? Which is that even within simple reproduction, right, you're going to have tendencies which just don't fit in the smooth running of the system, right? And this is another point in terms of the payment of wages to workers. He's saying workers' wage labor has to be paid in money. So capitalists always initiate the relationship, but they always have to have enough money to pay their workers. And that's a characteristic of the capitalist system. And so the workers are paid money, and with that money, they buy, they buy means of consumption. Okay. Now, there's lots of ways in which this might go wrong. Okay. The movement of money could spell problems for reproduction through circulation in the market. One of those we've already mentioned, which is reproduction of fixed capital at a stroke. Another one is these different production periods. Another one is distance from the market. Another one is they have to buy loads of stock. So all the time, Marx is sort of building in. As soon as you get to the level of detail, there's a high degree of unpredictability and variations in how this might actually work, right? He calls this spontaneous, but it's more like, I don't know, detailed reality, if you like, right? Movement had only to be noticed and brought to light by experience in order to give rise both to a methodical use of the mechanical aids of the credit system and to the actual fishing out of the available loan capital. So once again, he's saying, well, a lot of this is immediately solved by the use of credit. Of course, it brings with it its own level of problems, but that's the way his argument goes. And I'll just talk about this one because I do find this interesting. It's one of those sort of like afternote type sections, I have to say, but it that carries a degree of interest in it, right? Marx has quite a detailed critique of this guy who I'd never heard of, Destutt de Tracy, who was basically a Smithian economist, also from France in this case, right? And he basically says, how do capitalists make profits? And the way he argues they make profits is a fairly standard bourgeois argument, which we inherit to this day, right? Which is, he says, well, they're good at cheating each other when they sell commodities, and as well as selling to each other higher prices than they should, they sell to workers at higher prices than they should, and they also sell to idle capitalists, he calls them, at higher prices than they should. And so it's all about the idea that the commodities are sold at higher prices than the real cost. And of course, Marx argues in a great deal of detail in volume 3, which is higher than cost is not the same as higher than value, right? So in effect, the idea is that profits come from being clever in circulation. And it is a standard capitalist view. And Marx very thorough critique of it in volume 3, right? And he ends by saying this is bourgeois cretinism. I mean, it's a complete idiocy as far as Marx is concerned, that the profit in society comes from what must actually in the end be a zero-sum game of circulation of one set of people cheating another set of people. And that's a long-standing argument he's got. Now, where the interest is that he actually does refer to his own work in Theories of Surplus Value, which is a fuller critique of this guy. And actually, I found this I don't encourage you to read Theories of Surplus Value yet in full, but this entry is actually very interesting, right? Because what he goes a bit further here, and what he explains is when de Tracy talks about the laboring class, he actually means the capitalist class, right? The industrial capitalist. He's arguing the point of view of the industrial capitalist, right? So in a way, his critique of the idling class is very similar to the type of approach that Keynesians would take. So you've got the producers and the rentiers, is that type of configuration, and that's sort of built in to industrial capital's view of the world, right? So Marx obviously has got a counter logic to this, right? Which is that profit doesn't come from circulation. It comes from within the producing class. There are actually two distinct classes, right? But again, there's an interesting methodological point here, right? He says you've got to first establish industrial profit, which comes from industrial capitalists exploiting industrial workers. And then you can see how the so-called idling classes, which are the rentiers and the moneylenders, where they get their share or their part of the industrial profit. I mean, so it's an important point actually against Harvey, because Harvey doesn't follow Marx's methodology. But of course, also it's a point against de Tracy and latter day de Tracy's, which is arguing a class standpoint. Who are the producing class, right? Well, you've got to look at it in terms of who are the real producers, which are the workers, wage laborers. Okay. Now, Harvey skips this. He skips this, not just this reference to theories of surplus value, but the whole of section 13. And I think there's a reason for it, right? Because Marx is actually arguing why, once again, the order of his presentation is at stake here, his methodological step-by-step presentation, which Harvey completely disrupts and undermines. So I will stop sharing. And I'm very happy for discussion and contestation as fits. I'm still the man in the grey mask. I'm sorry about that. As you can see, it's quite, I spent a lot of time. I didn't realize how much time I'm spending on going over chapter 20, but I know that, I mean, we get the feedback, when people are still engaging with it. So I hope it was helpful.
Thank you very much, Andy. Right, okay, so time for discussion. As always, it's nice to see people's faces, so feel free to switch on your camera so we have this sort of sense that we're all involved in a seminar. It's always a nice thing. But don't feel obliged to. Okay, you want to put your electronic hands up so I can see and. Well, I've got something. I can make a point actually, but just in relation to just the Tracy or Tracy,
Mm.
I mean, because I've actually, interestingly, I've been working on him just recently. I know him in two ways. He wrote a commentary on Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, and I've been working on natural law theory in 18th century France. So that's how one of the reasons why I came across him. But another is that the work on Marxist theory of ideology, usually people who write about Marxism and ideology, they draw attention to just the Tracy, because he's supposed to have coined the term, use the word in French, of course, allegedly. And that's a common thing. But the point I want to make, the real one, the substantive one, is this. If you think about French political thought in the 18th century, around the time of the French Revolution, and I have in mind particularly Sieyès and his pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? They've got this idea, of course, of a productive class and a class of idle parasites, a sterile class, the points that you were making. But in this literature, especially in Sieyès' pamphlet, that class of idle parasites is actually the French aristocracy, and people like Sieyès, and I suspect this is probably true of de Tracy also, tend to think of the third estate, this sort of blanket term, as being the productive class, not the working class, of course, but the class that in French society that Marx would have considered to be the bourgeoisie, I think. So that puts a new sort of take, I think, on this idea of what is the class of idlers and the parasitic class in the thinking of somebody like de Tracy.
Yeah, that's very helpful actually. I think I'm very consistent, I think, and explains it more fully. Yeah, I agree.
So I'm waiting for somebody to put I think that would flash up, wouldn't it?
Kill this one. I think also people are still reading through. I appreciate we had to keep the lecture schedule going. Okay, yeah, Giovanni, come on.
Andy and Tony, do you
Hi.
hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. Because I cannot, I don't know why I cannot find the usual little hand, yellow hand.
Oh, yeah,
So, hi to everybody. Thank you, Andy, for this wonderful lecture. I have two questions. First is not a question, it's really something that maybe I don't get really. Your distinction and clarification between the constant capital consumed and the applied I mean, let me find your slide. Yeah, applied and consumed. Yes. So I will try to tell you what I got it, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong. Cioè, consumed is the circulating capital that includes, of course, variable capital, but also the part of constant capital that is ancillaries, raw materials, but also this consumed part includes the wear and tear, I mean, something that is not fixed capital. So this is the consumed part. And the applied part, it includes also the machines that are working on production. Therefore, it includes also fixed capital because it's the part of the machine or not. So I mean, this consumed part is only the one that is circulating, and the applied part, it includes also what? It is not really clear to me yet. So then I have another question, but please.
Yeah, well,
please
thank you.
Try to answer me this. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question, actually. Or the comment, because it is technical, but it happens to be very important when we come to volume 3 again, as it turns out, right? And so, why is because there's a big mistake in almost all the interpretive literature on the transformation problem, which confused the capital advanced, which is another category again, which is the total investment in all the machinery, all the raw materials, all the variable capital, to set up business. That's capital advanced, right? And so what Marx sometimes calls capital used up or capital consumed, right? Okay, this is the constant capital, not variable capital, used up or consumed, which is passed over into the commodity product. Okay, and that capital. Now let me answer your question, right?
Yes, yes, of course.
The capital used up or consumed. Used up and consumed are direct synonyms. Okay, you replace one for the other. There's no difference in meaning, right? Capital used up, capital consumed has got two components. One is the circulating capital applied. Okay. Right. And the other is the depreciation of the fixed capital.
Okay.
So it's slightly the other way. I mean, you got the concept. It's just you got all the right notes, but not in the right order in this occasion, right? So
great. So please let me repeat because I really.
Well, you didn't let me. Let me spell it out before you repeat. Yeah.
Go.
So the constant capital used up or consumed equals circulating capital applied, circulating constant capital applied, plus annual depreciation of fixed capital. Okay. I'm just repeating, I know, but just to make it clear. Yeah, go ahead.
Great, thank you. So Andy, because you understand. I mean, it's constant capital applied plus the wear and tear that gives the constant. That gives the constant capital consumed.
The wear and tear is a way Marx often puts it. He's talking about fixed capital here. It's depreciation of fixed capital.
Yes, but it's not, of course, the big machine still working. The value of the machine is the part of the machine that is losing its value. I mean, it's the little part of the machine that lost value. So this is the depreciation, right? And so inside this consumed capital, you put these two elements. On the one hand, the totally consumed in circulation, plus this wear and tear. Am I correct?
Yeah, very close to it. The last part, I actually think that Marx is not entirely consistent about how he explains depreciation, right? Because he often calls it wear and tear, but it doesn't have to be wear and tear, right? Because that's a material thing, right? It's a portion of the value of the fixed capital that's passed over bit by bit over, say it's 10-year cycle, or if it's buildings, it's 30-year cycle. I mean, if you think of buildings, it's a bit clearer the distinction, right? I mean, it's not the issue that, the buildings ceilings are falling down bit by bit or something. I mean, they have to maintain their use value, right? It's just a portion of the value that's passed over year by year.
Wonderful. Really, really helpful. So maybe I will keep my second question for later. So if somebody else want to ask something.
Okay. I still can't see any hands. I wonder if there's any issue with the yellow hand business.
Giovanni, let's go to your question too. You're welcome. Thank you for it.
So great. So I already anticipated to you sometimes this. It's about when you say, I mean, it's not you, because I totally agree that it's a kind of faithful reproduction of what Marx says, but it makes me puzzle. This question that all starts in the process from the wages paid, because I understand this at the level of the single capital or even individual capital or even branches, but we are at the level of the total social capital. So we are at the starting moment of the year, where in your map, in your wonderful drawings, there is the constant capital that is in the machine that were produced and are surviving and are ready to produce for the next year. And this is the things that Smith doesn't understand. So we know that is this part. Then there is, of course, the labor power that is available of the workers. But then about these things that the wages are starting everything. As far we are at the level of the total capital, nothing has been already produced at the level of the leisure, the luxury food, the necessary commodities for the workers. So for me, this money is totally without meaning because it cannot buy anything. So when Marx says that these wages are the engine that is starting the production, we could already say that, I mean, that you repeated several times, and I agree that Marx says capitalist or capital is the starting point and the worker are passive, have a passive role. We could even say in a totally opposite way that it's not true, because until the workers are not really actively producing something that can be consumed, I mean the consumption article, nothing can be given as wage. Is only totally abstract money. Cioè, I want to say, you cannot eat money. Cioè, that's my conclusion. So why Marx starts to say that at the level of the total, because of course my reasoning can be only valid at the total social per capita, because if we speak at the level of a single capital, we can always suppose that we are in the middle of the year. There are some other departments that are producing already the food, the clothes for, but we are at the beginning of the year, all is starting. Why can we are allowed to say that wages are the beginning? I mean, money is so important. Why?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very fair question, actually. Again, okay, my take on this is if you think of the work as a whole, right? Marx has got two subjects. You cannot understand the capitalist mode of production in Marxist terms without seeing that it, at its fundamental root is a class antagonism between capital and labor. And that means that he's not just talking in Hegelian terms of one self-developing subject. He's talking about capital as the dominant subject in relation to labor. I mean, if it wasn't a dominant subject, we wouldn't be talking about the capitalist mode of production, right? So there's a domination of capital over labor in this relation. Now, the way the domination works depends on the perspective at which we look at it from, right? So in volume 1, Marx explains the domination works by the appropriation of surplus value, right? So he's looking at the class relationship in its actuality, if you like, in the labor process, right? The way the domination works in volume 2 is different, or comes from a different perspective, I think, right? Because it is this idea in circulation of capital going through these different moments in circulation. And it kind of like it uses labor at one point in production, picks up the surplus value, and then just moves on, right? So if you just took that view, you could see labor as being sort of reduced almost like to another use value in a way. You know, it uses trees, it uses machines, it uses raw materials, and it uses labor type thing, right? Of course, the uniqueness of labor is it's the source of the new value. So Marx doesn't lose sight of that even in volume 2, right? But there is this question of the sort of the dominant subject and the subsidiary subject, and I do think that that's how more or less he presents the departments of production, right? So we, you know, he's all of volume 2. He starts off with the movement of capital, and I think the departments of production are primarily about the movements of capital, and so that's the dominant subject. So capitalists go into production. I mean, I think you're right. I just can't quite sort of reproduce it clearly, right? You're saying it's a question of the individual capitalists and the aggregate social total capital. The thing about the total capital here is it's not a real manifestation, right? There isn't a total capital, or maybe there is, and I'm just sort of hesitating how I say this, right? Because it does work at a system level as well. But basically, capital advances money as wages, right? And workers get that money in order to survive. I mean, it's a dominant relationship. You can argue that it starts with workers. Of course, workers produce the value, but they produce the value in a capitalist system as the dominated subject. And that domination is even there in circulation as well as in production. And I don't know if that quite, I don't know if that gets the point you're making. I do think there's another very big point, which I think you've mentioned in conversation before, Giovanni, which I do appreciate. I think the question of the reproduction of the wages year on year is highly questionable. You can understand how you can argue like all the means of production and all the luxury consumption is produced one year and consumed the next. But it's kind of like it's all in year mostly, isn't it? I mean, workers get, you'd have to sort of have an in year concept for the reproduction of labor power. It's not like from one year to the next. And so he doesn't really go into that. And I think if you wanted to challenge him, I would think that's stronger ground.
Thank you, Andy. I really like your answer. I think we are saying the same things in a way that is, my point of view is an ideological point. The worker must absorb the ideology of capital and must accept that is not worth anything until he gets not money to produce. But what I wanted to say that Marx sometimes is objective in his description of the system. So for me, in a way, he's a bit on the side of capital in this view, because objectively, if we think objectively, we cannot argue really that this money is so important until the worker has produced enough goods to make the money meaningful. You know what I mean? So I mean, it's a kind of objective perspective, and Marx seems to take too much the perspective of capital at this point. That was my view. Like Tony emphasized, Destruct de Tracy was the inventor of the term ideology. So I think it's very appropriate that in a way we are speaking now about, like you said, is a question of domination of the capital on the worker, because it's really like that. Otherwise, this money is not really objectively necessary to the system. I don't know, but maybe I'm still wrong that I think money is overplayed in this kind of description. Okay. Anyway, thank you. Thank you.
I'm very happy for other people to come in on this point, but I'm not quite sure. It's true that this is if you like, an objectivist account here. That's fair comment. I mean, he does have a go in the stuff on Tracy, actually have a go at sort of the subjective, the way capital understands it, right? And he deconstructs that. I see Tim wants to come in. I mean, the thing is, if workers don't have access to the means of production, it's not just ideology that they accept a wage. They may not accept it, but they haven't got much choice. I mean, they got to work and they got to be paid. I mean, that does come with the ideology of a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. And that's the ideological terrain, I think, which is, what does the wage actually represent? Part of the working day or the whole working day? And Marx certainly does contest that terrain. So I'm not, let's see what Tim has to say.
Tim?
Just to throw the question back to Giovanni and ask, if you pursue that conception that Marx is looking at it from the capitalist point of view, do you have a conception of what the counterpoint would be, looking at it, objectively from the work, or objectively or subjectively from the worker's point of view? I mean, what would look differently in your opinion?
Exactly what I said before, that the real starting point is when these poor workers are finally starting to produce something, some food, some clothes, some products that then can be bought back by the wages, until they don't at the level of the total social capital, of course. No, we are speaking about the year, the annual situation where we start, because Marx makes this model that Andy has explained to us very clearly, that there is the beginning of the new year, where that Smith doesn't understand anything, that at the beginning of the new year, there are already constant capital ready to production, and also variable capital, that is the labor power of these poor workers that were eating enough the year before, and now they are ready to produce. But my point is, until they don't produce, this money is only an advance of anything, of nothing. And Marx many times make this point, that he says, they buys back their own production. No, you remember in Capital Volume 1. But now here it seems to say everything starts. So I want to understand, what does it really mean everything starts with this wages money? From the point of view of the ideology of capital, or from the point of view of the objective movement of the system? Because if this is the first view, I totally agree. The ideology is that if the capitalist doesn't give money, nothing starts. But this is capitalist ideology. For me, it could be the opposite. If I am a worker, that I am politicized enough, I could say, until I don't produce, you cannot do any fucking anything with your fucking money. Sorry for the expression. No, you know, so I agree with Andy when he says that there is a class struggle already, but I don't really understand where this class struggle is from the point of view of Marx's view, because it seems that there is a total domination, you know, and is even objective. So I'm a bit confused about this objectivity, maybe because I'm very interested about the ideological point of view.
I don't know, Tim. I mean, my view, right? I think this is Marx's own, if you like, self-discipline in a very patient way. He does these layers in Capital, right? I do think also that the best class struggle discussion he has is in his discussion with the First International, right? That famous value, price, and profit. I mean, there he really brings all his value theory to bear in terms of explaining the class struggle. And I think you can take loads of parts of Capital where it's there, but it's not so. It's in the background. It's not in the foreground, right? And I do think there's a related point, which is it's actually a different debate. It's not the point you're making, but it does move over to this debate, which is the underconsumptionists keep saying, right? Well, just get the system could survive and work just by paying the workers more, right? Why don't they do that, right? And in that sense, you can almost appeal to workers' agency. You could make it a point of view of, demand higher wages, right? I mean, workers, of course, should demand higher wages and defend their standard of living, but it slightly misses the point, right? Which is the reason that capital advances wages is it advantages it as variable capital. It's kind of like the point you're saying, right? What the capitalist gets back for their wages is the living labor power in production, right? That they want to command. Of course, they may or may not be successful in that command, right? And Marx here is assuming they are successful, and it's like a normal functioning of the system. He doesn't involve sort of disruption to the system by workers refusing to work as elements of variable capital, right? The thing is, right, there is another ideological falsity in my view, right, which is that even if the workers do refuse to work, or other points in circulation it breaks down, right, that in and of itself does not end the system, right? And that's a sort of like the point is also the systemic totality, which we're building towards. We're not entirely getting there, right? And the capitalists will only advance wages if they estimate and have good reasons to assume they're going to make a profit out of it. I mean, that's the thing. And so everything depends on the profitability of the enterprise, basically. And even from the point of view of capital logic, if you like. So we still haven't got the full story yet. We've got the possibility, he's undermining the idea that this is all a perfectly equilibrium, perfectly working machine, right? But he hasn't yet told us why it must go into crisis. So I mean, I don't think the text justifies all of the people who say that this is Marx's equilibrium theory. I don't think it justifies that at all, right? But at the same time, it's not yet his crisis theory either. It's something.
Yes, this is very, very helpful. Yes.
So, anybody else like to? Perhaps I could just make a comment about the ideological side of thing. I mean, Andy, you mentioned the idea of the slogan, per day pay for a fair day's work. But the other side is a similar slogan, just the idea of a free contract. These sort of workers allegedly enter into this contract of employment freely, consensually, and of course, so how could that possibly be a bad thing? And I think the idea of, in some sense or other, Marx obviously thinks that clearly that argument doesn't work, that this is not genuinely a free contract at all, and in some sense it is coercive. I think the situation is a coercive one if it's the case that all you can do is choose which particular capitalist is going to exploit you. You can't choose not to be exploited. It's sort of so there is clearly an element of not consent but coercion involved. So the relationship doesn't just rely on ideology, which is a means for engineering consent. It is actually a coercive one in some sense of the term.
Well, absolutely, and I think you put it well, actually, because it is the combination, isn't it? Because the coercion is covered by the ideological value.
Exactly. Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
And these are very good points, Giovanni. I mean, they're very thoughtful points.
No, but I really like also your point, and I think we should really respect that. That is a Marx ability to trace different layers and take different perspectives in different books. So it does never want to tell the end of the novel or the whole truth. So sometimes it seems that the capital is really the machine unescapable, and in other moments, I mean, it's like you cannot really say everything at once. Maybe this is the point. I don't know, but still, sometimes you have this feeling that this idea of, we were speaking about it also in the reading group, that you were constantly reminding us, but money is important, money is important. So my resistance to this, probably wrong resistance, is that, okay, money is important, but until they don't produce anything, they must be convinced that money is important and shut up and work, because otherwise this money is not capable to buy anything. So that's the objective point.
I'm probably, you're right. Of course. I mean, I'm worrying away about Marx and Money in Volume 2, to be honest. If you have a chance to read that collected book, and if anybody wants, I can send you my copy of it on Volume 2. I just read over the weekend the chapter by Martha Campbell, which is very scholarly, very interesting. I mean, I don't fully agree with her, but I do think she knows, she's helpful and throws some light on what Marx is trying to do about, this whole thing is, right, commodities exchange for money. So you kind of like, they're co-determined. You can't have one without the other, basically. And so at every level at the commodities determined. If you've got commodity capital, then you're going to have some type of money which is exchanged for commodity capital. And that's what, we're wrestling with.
So we've run out of time, I'm afraid.
Yeah, on time.
Well, I'm quite happy to if you want to carry on, but I have to go.
No, I think, well, from my point of view, I think we're natural end point anyway.
Yeah. So okay. Well, in that case, let's thank Andy in the usual manner for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you for the great.
You can't see me, but you can hear me.
Thank you. You can't see me.
Okay. So
next time.
And thank you everybody for attending, and we'll see you all. I can't remember when the next one is. In about a month's time, isn't it? It's October.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Okay. Thank you. Bye.